Imagine waking up in 2026, turning on your computer, and realizing that the question is no longer, should I try Linux? But instead, why am I still using Windows or macOS at all? That shift didn't happen overnight, but right now it feels like we're standing at a tipping point. Linux desktops, once mocked as hobbyist toys or systems only developers could love, have quietly evolved into something genuinely impressive, polished, and frankly a little scary for the big players. This isn't about Linux finally catching up anymore. It's about Linux carving out its own identity and, in many areas, outright surpassing what Windows and macOS are offering to everyday users. In 2026, Linux desktops aren't just good, they're arguably too good for Microsoft and Apple to stay comfortable. For years, the biggest criticism of Linux desktops was usability. People said they were ugly, inconsistent, or too complicated for normal users. You had to open a terminal, memorize strange commands, and fix things yourself. That image stuck around far longer than it deserved. Fast forward to today, and the reality looks completely different. Modern Linux desktops boot fast, look beautiful, feel responsive, and can be used productively without ever touching a command line. Distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux Mint, Zorin OS Pub, _OS, and newer entrants have refined the desktop experience to the point where it feels deliberate and thoughtful rather than experimental. Animations are smooth, layouts make sense, and the systems feel lightweight even on older hardware. When you compare this to Windows 11, which continues to grow heavier and more intrusive, or macOS, which keeps pushing users deeper into Apple's walled garden, Linux suddenly looks like the platform that actually respects your time and your machine. Performance is one of the first areas where Linux desktops really shine in 2026. On the same hardware, Linux often feels faster and more responsive than Windows or macOS. Boot times are shorter, background processes are fewer, and system resources aren't constantly being eaten by telemetry ads or services you didn't ask for. This matters more than ever now that people are holding onto their devices longer. Not everyone is upgrading their laptop every 2 years anymore. Linux breathes new life into older machines, turning hardware that struggles with modern Windows into something snappy and enjoyable again. That alone is enough to make Windows nervous, because Microsoft's entire strategy depends on pushing users toward newer hardware and deeper integration with its ecosystem. Then there's customization, which has always been Linux's secret weapon but is now more accessible than ever. In 2026, Linux desktops let users shape their experience in ways that Windows and macOS simply don't allow. Want a workflow that looks and behaves exactly like macOS? You can do that. Prefer something closer to classic Windows, or even a completely unique layout that fits your personal habits? That's also possible. Desktop environments like GNOME, KDE Plasma, Cinnamon, and Cosmic have matured into highly polished systems with clear design philosophies. KDE Plasma in particular has reached a level of refinement where it feels both powerful and approachable, offering deep customization without forcing it on users who just want things to work. This flexibility isn't about endless tweaking for the sake of it anymore. It's about empowering users rather than locking them into one correct way of working. Privacy is another massive reason. Linux desktops are becoming so attractive in 2026. Users are more aware than ever of how much data their operating systems collect. Windows has steadily increased its telemetry over the years, and while Microsoft claims it's for improving the experience, many users feel uncomfortable with how deeply it's embedded. macOS, while often perceived as more privacy-friendly, still ties users closely to Apple's services and hardware ecosystem. Linux, by contrast, offers transparency. Most distributions collect little to no data by default, and when they do, it's usually optional and clearly explained. The open-source nature of Linux means that anyone can audit the code. You don't have to trust a corporation's word. You can verify how the system works. In an era where digital privacy feels increasingly fragile, that transparency is incredibly powerful. Software availability used to be another major sticking point. The argument was always the same. Linux is nice, but I need my apps. That excuse is getting weaker every year. In 2026, the rise of cross-platform applications and web-based tools means that most people's daily workflow already works perfectly on Linux. Browsers, office suites, design tools, communication apps, and development environments are all there. LibreOffice has matured into a genuinely strong alternative to Microsoft Office for most use cases. Professional tools like Blender, Krita, and DaVinci Resolve run natively on Linux and are widely used in creative industries. For developers, Linux has always been home, but now even non-technical users benefit from the stability and consistency that developer-first platforms bring. Gaming, once Linux's biggest weakness, has turned into one of its most surprising strengths. Thanks largely to Valve's investment in Proton and Steam, gaming on Linux in 2026 is no longer a niche experiment. Thousands of Windows games run flawlessly on Linux, often with performance that rivals or even exceeds their Windows counterparts. Anti-cheat compatibility, long a roadblock, has improved dramatically. The success of devices like the Steam Deck has proven that Linux can deliver a mainstream gaming experience. This matters because gaming has always been a major reason people stuck with Windows. As that barrier crumbles, Windows loses one of its strongest advantages. Stability and updates are another area where Linux desktops quietly outperform the competition. On Windows, updates are notorious for breaking things, forcing restarts at inconvenient times, or introducing bugs that take months to fix. macOS updates are generally smoother, but often come with dropped support for older hardware or changes that users didn't ask for. Linux distributions tend to offer more control. You decide when and how to update. Long-term support releases provide years of stability, while rolling release distributions offer the latest software for those who want it. This choice is crucial. It respects different types of users instead of forcing everyone into the same update cycle. Security is often misunderstood in conversations about operating systems. Linux desktops benefit from a combination of design choices and community practices that make them inherently more secure. Permissions are strict by default. Malware targeting Linux desktops is relatively rare, and vulnerabilities are often patched quickly thanks to open collaboration. This doesn't mean Linux is magically immune to security issues, but it does mean that users are less likely to be exposed to the kind of widespread malware campaigns that regularly target Windows. For businesses and institutions, this translates into lower risk and lower maintenance costs, which is why Linux continues to gain ground in professional environments as well. Another subtle but important shift in 2026 is how Linux desktops feel philosophically aligned with users. Windows increasingly feels like a service rather than a product, filled with ads, subscriptions, and nudges toward Microsoft's ecosystem. macOS feels polished and premium, but also restrictive, designed primarily to serve Apple's hardware strategy. Linux, on the other hand, feels like it exists for the user. You're not constantly being pushed toward a store, a subscription, or a cloud service. You're not treated as a data source. That sense of ownership is something people didn't realize they were missing until they experienced it. The community aspect of Linux has also evolved. In the past, communities could feel intimidating or dismissive toward newcomers. While that still exists in some corners, many modern Linux communities are welcoming, helpful, and focused on making the desktop experience better for everyone. Documentation has improved, forums are more beginner-friendly, and distributions actively design with new users in mind. This cultural shift matters just as much as technical improvements, because adoption isn't just about features. It's about how people feel when they ask for help. From an industry perspective, the rise of Linux desktops in 2026 represents a real strategic threat. Microsoft has responded by embracing Linux in some ways, especially through tools like WSL, but that also normalizes Linux for developers and power users. Once people get comfortable with Linux tools, the idea of running Linux as their primary desktop becomes less intimidating. Apple, meanwhile, continues to focus on vertical integration, which works well for its loyal user base but leaves little room for flexibility or experimentation. As Linux desktops become more polished, they start to look like the best of both worlds, powerful and open like classic computing, but modern and user-friendly like today's mainstream platforms. It's also worth talking about cost, especially in a global context. Linux desktops are free, and not in the free trial or limited version sense. This matters enormously in regions where expensive software licenses are a barrier to entry. Students, freelancers, small businesses, and entire schools can deploy Linux without worrying about activation keys or subscriptions. In a world where software costs keep rising, Linux offers an alternative that doesn't compromise on quality. That alone is enough to make commercial operating systems uneasy. In 2026, Linux desktops are no longer trying to convince people that they're good enough. They're confidently demonstrating that they can be better in many ways. Better performance on the same hardware, better respect for privacy, better customization, better control over updates, and increasingly better compatibility with mainstream software and games. Windows and macOS still have their strengths, especially in enterprise environments and tightly integrated ecosystems, but the gap has narrowed dramatically. For the first time in decades, it feels plausible that a significant number of everyday users could choose Linux not out of ideology or necessity, but simply because it offers the best experience. So when we say that Linux desktops are getting too good in 2026, what we really mean is that they're no longer playing defense. They're not just an alternative. They're a serious contender. Windows and macOS should be worried, not because Linux will suddenly replace them everywhere, but because it gives users a real choice. And once people realize they have that choice, and that it doesn't involve sacrificing usability, performance, or modern features, the balance of power starts to shift. Quietly, steadily, Linux desktops have grown up. And now they're standing right next to the giants, daring them to keep up.